Hello everyone, this is your Professor Arda Arıkan speaking. So far we have talked about and read about various schools of criticism, and today we'll be talking about post-colonial theory. In order to understand post-colonial theory, first we have to have a sound understanding of colonialism. Now, colonialism, by definition, is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. One of the difficulties in defining colonialism is that it is hard to distinguish it from imperialism. Now, colonialism and imperialism may sound like they are very similar. And oftentimes, these two concepts are treated as though they are synonyms. However, there is a slight difference that makes colonialism and imperialism separate entities. Yes, like colonialism, imperialism also involves political and economic control over a dependent territory. The etymology of the two terms, however, provides some clues about how they differ. The term colony comes from the Latin word colonus, meaning farmer. This root reminds us that the practice of colonialism usually involved the transfer of population to a new territory, where the arrivals lived as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. That is to say, when we talk about colonialism, we talk about a group of people being moved to another territory who, in return, dominated that particular territory for their country of origin. Now, imperialism, on the other hand, comes from the Latin term imperium, meaning to command. Thus, the term imperialism draws attention to the way that one country exercises power over another, whether through settlement, sovereignty, or indirect mechanisms of control. Now, how did the Western people dominate the Eastern, Southern, Northern, Far Eastern lands? Now, you all know the story of the British or Portuguese or Spaniards moving into the far corners of the Americas. Similar to that, in the 19th century, the tension between liberal thought and colonial practice became particularly acute as dominion of Europe over the rest of the world reached its zenith. Ironically, in the same period when most political philosophers began to defend the principles of universalism and equality, the same individuals still defended the legitimacy of colonialism and imperialism. That is to say, many philosophers who lived in the 19th century, although they appeared to be defenders of universalism, equality, and so on, they still defended the values and practices operated through colonialism and imperialism. Well, how did they do that? Well, one way of reconciling those apparently opposed principles was the argument known as the Civilizing Mission of the West, which suggested that a temporary period of political dependence or tutelage was necessary in order for the uncivilized societies to advance to the point where they were capable of sustaining liberal institutions and self-government. That is to say, in order to justify their colonial and imperial hopes and willingness, these philosophers and politicians of the West suggested that they were colonizing and imperializing, let's say, African countries in order to bring them happiness, democracy, self-government, and so forth. Well, such view and practice was challenged by numerous philosophers, thinkers, writers, researchers, and academics, among whom Edward Said is the leading one. Now, the field of post-colonial studies was influenced mainly by Edward Said's path-breaking book titled Orientalism. In Orientalism, Said applied Michel Foucault's technique of discourse analysis to the production of knowledge about the Middle East. The term Orientalism described a structured set of concepts, assumptions, and discursive practices that were used to produce, interpret, and evaluate knowledge about non-European peoples. Said's analysis made it possible for scholars to deconstruct literary and historical texts in order to understand how they reflected and reinforced the imperialist project, by and large. Unlike previous studies that focused on the economic or political logics of colonialism, Said's work drew attention to the relationship between knowledge and power. Orientalism, hence, can be seen as an attempt to extend the geographical and historical terrain of the post-structuralist critique of Western epistemology. So, what is Orientalism and its functions? Said uses the term Orientalism in several different ways. First, Orientalism is a specific field of academic study about the Middle East and Africa, albeit one that Said conceives quite expansively to encompass history, sociology, literature, anthropology, and especially philology. He also identifies it as a practice that helps define Europe by creating a stable depiction of its other, its constitutive outside. That is to say, people from the West has a certain way of looking at those people from the East, and this view is transferred onto the Eastern people, who start to see themselves from the lenses of the West. Orientalism is a way of characterizing Europe by drawing a contrasting image or idea based on a series of binary oppositions. For instance, the West being rational, focusing on the mind, demanding order, whereas the East being irrational, focusing on the body, and living in chaos. Now, finally, Said emphasizes that it is also a mode of exercising authority by organizing and classifying knowledge about the Orient. What does a post-colonial critic do? Contemporary literary theorists who identify themselves as post-colonial critics have drawn attention to practices of representation that reproduce a logic of subordination that endures even after former colonies gain independence. Furthermore, they deconstructed literary and historical texts in order to understand how those texts reflected and reinforced imperialist projects. Well, in addition to these, post-colonial critics started to interrogate universal categories such as capitalism, class, rationality, objectivity, democracy, and liberalism. They question these categories by paying special attention to how each changes the content and form of the colonized. Finally, a post-colonial critic would look at how notions such as democracy and liberalism perpetuates the conditions of colonialism and imperialism. While doing these, post-colonial critics ask certain questions while reading literary texts. According to Tyson, such questions include: how does the literary text explicitly or allegorically represent various aspects of colonial oppression? Furthermore, what does the text reveal about the problematics of post-colonial identity, including the relationship between personal and cultural identity and such issues as double consciousness and hybridity? What persons or groups does the work identify as other or stranger, or at times weird, awkward? How are such persons groups described and treated in those texts? Furthermore, how does the text reveal about the politics and or psychology of anti-colonialist resistance? What about the cultural difference? Post-colonial critics ask, for instance, what does the text reveal about the operations of cultural difference, the ways in which race, religion, class, gender, sexual orientation, cultural beliefs, and customs combine to form individual identity in shaping our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world in which we live? How does the text respond to or comment upon the characters, themes, or assumptions of a canonized, colonized, colonialist work? Are there meaningful similarities among the literatures of different post-colonial populations? How does a literary text in the Western canon reinforce or undermine colonialist ideology through its representation of colonization and or its inappropriate silence about colonized peoples? Now, these were and have been important questions that have been asked by post-colonial critics. There are many other questions to be asked as well, among which the following ones were the most important. How did the experience of colonization affect those who were colonized while also influencing the colonizers? Or how were colonial powers able to gain control over so large a portion of the non-Western world, including such countries like India, China, Thailand, and many African countries by and large? What traces have been left by colonial education, science and technology in post-colonial societies? And what were the forms of resistance against colonial control? How did, in other terms, the colonized refuse that colonial control? How did colonial education and language influence the culture and identity of the colonized? How did Western science, technology, and medicine change existing knowledge systems? And what are the emergent forms of post-colonial identity after the departure of the colonizers? That is to say, yes, to a certain extent, officially at least, the United Kingdom stopped colonizing India. But for many years of their insistence on their land, they still left legacies behind which affected and still affect Indians living in that region. To what extent has decolonization, that is to say, a reconstruction free from colonial influence, been possible? That is to say, after being so many years of colonization, can the colonized feel free and go back to basics again? How do gender, race, and class function in colonial and post-colonial discourse? Are new forms of imperialism replacing colonization, and how? And finally, what is the role of translation in post-colonial theory? Now, to set an example, I will provide a post-colonial reading of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Smart and Hutchinson's study of Bram Stoker's Dracula shows that the novel's historical meaning is familiar to most Victorians. That is to say, because the text was written during the Victorian age, many Victorians could understand the text and relate to it because of its historical reality, although it is considered to be a Gothic piece of work in which various fantastic or occurred unreal elements exist. Now, in their critical application, Smart and Hutchison found that all of the characters' attempts to tell the story fail to bring order and sense to a world which is turned upside down. Second, their rereading of the novel shows that these various ways of telling history fail because the real story in Dracula is neither historical nor temporal. It is spatial, logged and preserved in cultural memory, which the principles of Stoker's story are continuously enjoined to ignore or forget. Thus, imperial narratives, they argue, whether historical or fictional, are arrangements of detail and events to serve a purpose, casting events and their causes into a progressive chronology, which argues for the greater good of the colonial enterprise. There are other books or works that should be read in order to understand post-colonial criticism. Edward Said's Orientalism, Kamau Brathwaite's The History of the Voice, Gayatri Spivak's In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics, Dominic Lacapra's The Bounds of Race, Perspectives on Hegemony and Resistance, and Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture. Well, we can also suggest an application. You can read the poem titled The African Burial Ground, study it from a post-colonial perspective by using one, two, or some of the questions proposed by post-colonial critics. The poet's name is Yusef Komunyaka, and he is from a country which was colonized. That is to say, by reading the content of this poem and asking timely questions set by post-colonial critics, we can apply post-colonial criticism into our reading of a poem. There are also some study questions. While answering these questions, you may have a look at this following link provided by Stanford University. Now, these study questions are: what is the difference between colonialism and imperialism? Find and write an example for colonialism and one for imperialism. How does imperialism work? What do power holders do to control relatively weaker ones? What sorts of arguments were proposed by some 19th century thinkers to justify and legitimize their colonial and imperial intentions? What was Edward Said's major contribution to post-colonial studies? Summarize his ideas on Orientalism as briefly as possible. and explain in your own words what a post-colonial critic actually does. And here are the references I used while preparing this lecture and PowerPoint slides for you. Thank you.